What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today, coming on the podcast for the very first time, despite the fact I've enjoyed his books and his own podcast for years, is Mark Vernon. He is a philosopher, a theologian, a public scholar, and reflector on religion in the spiritual marketplace of sorts. He's a constant dialogue partner with previous guest Rupert Sheldrake. They have a series of dialogues everyone should check out. And you know, he has done a number of recent videos and podcasts on the meaning crisis. What's going on in the West? What are the ways in which the spiritual crisis of sorts of our time is manifesting, trying to understand it, but also looking at the responses and the ways in which people are engaging different traditions, be it ancient or new. It was just exciting to get to talk to Mark. We also talk about some of the religion science questions and the way in which understanding the evolution of religion, are the psychological mechanisms and such that have generated its place and space and culture, help us understand the current challenges and what's going on. But it was a blast. I've always wanted to get to talk to Mark, and I was not disappointed, you know. So I'll put links on the post for you to be able to follow his podcast and video series, check out his books and such. He's a wonderful communicator and is able to synthesize all sorts of big ideas and major texts and put them in conversation with questions that many people carry. And I think one of the reasons he's able to do this is because he's a practicing psychotherapist. He spends regular time working with individuals and doing the kind of one-on-one work. And the sensitivity you learn in that space is really shaping the power of his public voice. So if you're new to Mark, enjoy. If you came here because you know who Mark is, and you know, hopefully, you know, it's better than some of the other times you've seen him engage with someone, because hopefully my fanboy status doesn't distract you. Anyway, enjoy. This is Mark. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today on the podcast, I'm joined by Mark Vernon, who is a psychodynamic psychotherapist, a former Anglican priest, philosopher who studies ancient philosophy and medieval literature, and someone I've been stalking on the internet for quite a while. So it's kind of a joy to talk to the real you, because sometimes I talk to an imagined version of you, or upload your books into AI and have a conversation with the simulated version of you. So, I'm so excited for you to be here.
Hello, well, thank you. It's lovely to join you. I'm looking forward to what we might discuss.
One of the things that I think might be a place to start, especially for people who haven't been watching all the places you show up on the internet, along with your regular podcast with Rupert Sheldrake, who longtime listeners will know he's been on the podcast a number of times. I think it'd be interesting for you to share a bit of your kind of spiritual and intellectual biography of kind of growing up in a way where you got attracted to vocational life in the church, to moving beyond it and to engaging psychology and thinking about religion and science more broadly, and ultimately developing one of my favorite books I've read in the last few years on spiritual intelligence. But for people that may not understand the kind of eclectic and different paths that you've walked, both as a person and as a scholar, kind of give us a cliff notes here.
I mean, honestly, I feel like it's because a long time I didn't know what on earth I was doing, and went and did physics as an undergraduate, and then did theology when I trained to be a clergy person. That fell apart for one reason or another, and then did the philosophy at PhD level, and then I now work as a psychotherapist, as you're saying, and so that is another training and a whole set of engagements as well. But in a way, the thread is always been meaning, big questions. And I think that what's happened is that whereas in the physics, that started off more or less completely objectively, as if the truth is out there. Gradually, I've realised that more and more it's when head and heart connect that things really start to add up. And so I did this PhD on ancient Greek philosophy, Plato, and felt after that rather than modern philosophy, which sort of has physics envy, it wishes it could come up with Newton's second law of motion, but for the mind, more like ancient philosophy was psychotherapy, where there's both an assumption that who you are directly correlates to what you can know. And if you're a certain kind of person, then you're going to know certain kinds of things, which is why the ancient Greeks were so interested in virtue as well as in epistemology and metaphysics. So I feel like that's one of the things that's become a bit uncoupled. It's delivered certain things, objectivity clearly can put planes in the sky and so on, but it seems to leave us feeling alienated. And in a way, my story has been trying to grapple with that very modern predicament.
Yeah, I think you're right about the physics envy. It shows up regularly in even within kind of the academic theology. Before I moved back to the States, I was doing science and religion in Edinburgh for 3 years as part of the God and Book of Nature big research project, and it was fascinating to me how many of the scientists that I engaged with, and these are ones working on theories of consciousness, had that same predicament. Right, where the scientific investigation of consciousness, whether they're like, oh, well, the global neural workspace theory doesn't really work when you look at this kind of data, and the integrated information theories here, and so many of them came to see that their philosophical assumptions were now problematized by the scientific research, and it occasioned a host of these scientists to then ask these kind of metaphysical questions again, to go, what were these a prioris maybe that come because of the success of science that might have muted or bifurcated nature in ways that a real part of reality is present, but not one we get at in the same way we get at scientifically.
I mean, the other thing about it that I realised is that this bifurcation has happened relatively recently. I actually think it's not even particularly at Descartes, although he normally gets blamed. Because if you read his work, he's quite clearly got God on his mind as well. He's really a sort of dual aspect monist or something. The dual aspect being the mind and matter, but if you drop the God, then the mind and matter become uncoupled. But I think it's as much what happened in the 19th century, when things like fact and fiction got separated. Before that, a fact needed its fiction in order to make sense, and so the two would have gone together. Whereas now we've opposed them, so that you're supposed to have facts that stand alone and kind of judge you, and then the fiction is your personal gloss on that. And the trouble is that the facts have sort of nowhere to go. They become these like free-floating radicals, and so again leave us feeling disconnected and alienated. And now, of course, fact and fiction have gone to war with each other. You have fact checkers all the time in news, as if they're somehow going to pin down what really matters. But I think that this sign of fact and fiction now being at loggerheads is because they have become uncoupled. And what we need to recover is a sense that meaning and what happens intimately go together. There isn't, again, a kind of physics of modern events that if only you can get right, then everything will be sorted out. Which in a way, the people that peddle the fake news, if you like, those who get accused of that so much, there's a truth in what they're doing, which is that they've realized that the story matters, and the facts alone won't matter. So these two sides, which are kind of at loggerheads with each other at the moment, somehow we need to find a third space where we can, sure, describe what's going on, but say why it's going on as well, and so start feeling connected to the way we're telling our story, not disconnected.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. It reminds me of a moment in one of the science and religion seminars we had in Edinburgh, where the presentation was elicited one of those conversations that when you have scholars from different disciplines in the room, you realize the variety of unexamined a prioris everyone's carrying, where one of the philosophers of science is like, look, I think you just need to follow the facts, like look at the data. And another one's like, both of those phrases entail a narrative for interpretation. And there's a reason we do seminars on this, precisely because the presentation of data requires narration, and it works better with different modes of inquiry and different kinds of question coming in, right? And as the person that started as a philosophy and religion PhD and then got got into the science and philosophy of science stuff, I'm like, that's why our OG wrote dialogues and not essays, and definitely not analytic philosophy. And so I wonder, as someone who kind of coming out of that physics background and then did a PhD in Plato, like, is there, when you think of the kind of gift of both that format and that vision, is there like a particular dialogue that you love to point to or read to if someone's like having that intuition and is like, well, I don't know about messing with religious texts quite yet, but like when you think of the benefit of that kind of narrative presentation and dialogical engagement, where would you point to for Plato as to why physics meant, Mark needs to go ask this question with Plato and Socrates?
I mean, the Apology is a really good place to start. I mean, it's a very readable. It's basically Socrates' speech at his trial, where he's telling the Athenians why they shouldn't kill him, and it contains a lot of Socrates' own personal mythology, which hinges around, on the one hand, this great ancient injunction to know thyself, and Socrates receiving a message from the god Apollo, whose temple was in Delphi, with know thyself written above the temple, that no one was wiser than Socrates. And Socrates thinking, wait a minute, it doesn't quite work like that. And if you ever receive an oracle, you should always put it to the test. Those who take their oracles at face value are always the ones that come unstuck with them. We're constantly, I think, called to participate in that which we receive. And so Socrates does that, and he comes to this famous realization that he's wise because he realizes the extent of his ignorance. And so that then speaks to how what we human beings can grasp is only the kind of edge of a whole field of intelligence. But then, of course, that then speaks to how there's an intelligence out there as well as within here. And so it's that how we engage with that which we can't articulate as much as that which we can, that it feels we've become so bad at in the modern world. Whereas, our forebears would have had myth, and they would have had ritual, and they would have had stories about the spirits of place as well as the gods of time, and recovering some sense of how we can negotiate not just our sort of known unknowns, but our unknown unknowns. And that's actually enriching. It's not a failure, but it's also at the same time to get in touch with the spirit that dwells within us. Because I think another thing which we've forgotten about in the modern world is that to be a human is to have a mystery at the heart of yourself, which is where your life came from, where your consciousness came from, how it is that we have a powerful awareness of the world and so on. We're not strange miracles that popped out of a sea of complete nothingness, but that we are a manifestation of that sea of fullness. Yeah, so the minute you start, and funny enough, actually, physicists, in my experience, are actually really quite good at this. And my physics tutor is a chap called Carlos Frank. And when I did my physics, which was 30 years ago, he used to have a poster outside his door called Dark Matter, saying, "Dark matter, does it exist?" Because he worked on dark matter. And I've kept in touch with him, and he still has the same poster outside his door, "Dark matter, does it exist?" So he's a physicist working all his life on something he doesn't even know exists. But he's engaging with reality still. So there's this strange sort of double take that actually the physicists often know that they're participating in a wider intelligence that if they're lucky, they get kind of glimpses of.
Yeah. Have you been tempted just to put on your door, does the theosis of the cosmos exist?
Well, it's sort of, for me, my kind of, understanding of the divine is that should be written in. But of course, then it doesn't mean, does it exist like, you exist on the screen, I exist on the screen, but what is prior to the existence of all things? And that can't be existence itself, because it's something that gives rise to existence. So anyway, you get into the deeper philosophy of being at that point.
Yeah. Which if you're supervising dissertations, not a bad thing to make sure everyone walks into your office with mystery. It is one of those perks in Whitehead's dialogues when he moves to America and starts to see American religion. He goes, I think one of the problems of it is Their buildings aren't big enough, and they start too many worship services without music, and that just misses the very dynamic of wonder that has initiated these traditions to begin with.
No, that's very well put, actually. Because I mean, the energy you invoke tends to be the energy that then shapes your discussion. So there's a deep wisdom in starting anything with a piece of music or the right invocation.
So you mentioned just a minute ago that concept of spiritual intelligence. And I'd love to hear a bit of the origin story of the concept in the book, because in a sense, it weaves together the kind of things you were wrestling with intellectually through these different spaces, but also kind of harnesses the pragmatic wisdom of working with clients in your own kind of like day-to-day vocation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, particularly it came out of a project that I was involved with on spiritual intelligence, and the idea was to meet the rise of artificial intelligence with a sense of, okay, so what is our intelligence then? You know, it's become fairly accepted that whatever artificial intelligence is, it's different from human intelligence. So what it feels like not many people are asking is, so what is human intelligence? That, you know, instead getting anxious about the artificial intelligence. Whereas if you can understand the nature of human intelligence more richly, then maybe the artificial intelligence will feel like less of a threat. And so this was a group that brought together, you know, people working directly in the world of artificial intelligence, but also then who might have some expertise about whatever spiritual intelligence might be. And that included people that tell our story as human beings, as well as those who work maybe more overtly in theological circles. So, what emerged from that is how you can talk about our intelligence in lots of different ways. And it's as much a kind of a showing as a telling. But one of the ways that really did deeply impress me was the story that we tell ourselves about what it is to be human. And these big stories, you know, are very, very popular, easily the most successful, but others have followed in its wake, is Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. And if you read that, it's very brilliantly written, integrates all sorts of things and so on. But it's essentially a bleak story about what it is to be human. That we humans are lost in the cosmos. Luckily for us, we developed the capacity to tell ourselves fictions, which bonded us together well enough in order to be able to survive. And Harari, you know, adds, as it were, in a footnote, or doesn't quite say it actually, that in addition to that, all the fictions that have been told to this point, i.e. the science story of who we are, were false. But it didn't matter because they worked. And so he's at once like sort of damning our ancestors, as well as, you know, kind of doing a bit of a fudge to quite why the science story should be the one that's true and all the others should be false. When we just have this capacity to tell stories to help us stay alive, it's kind of left a bit hanging. But I wanted to tell get to grips with a different story, and so this came about through working with people like Robin Dunbar, the evolutionary psychologist, and others who were interested in the origins of religion, not as having instrumental value, i.e. to enable us to survive, but having exploratory value, that we human beings have this great fascination with the way that the world is, and we have this thing called self-consciousness or awareness, the capacity to reflect. And so this retells the story as how, you know, probably survival was just part and parcel of life, but wasn't the main driving issue for our ancestors. You know, it's often thought now that up until the emergence of civilizations, larger groups of humans, in other words, the business of survival was relatively straightforward. More, our ancestors would have had time on their hands in order to explore the nature of reality. And so myth and ritual and altered states of consciousness and that whole engagement with the world around them, both natural and supernatural, as we would now put it, might have been by far the greatest part of the human story up until about, well, maybe even like a couple of hundred years ago. And so rather than colonizing the past by projecting back the present onto it, which I think a lot of these big stories do, because they have a broadly progressive notion that things have got better as we've got smarter, and so now we can reject the past because we have a better account of it in the present. Maybe there's a whole different story there to tell, which is that we've definitely made gains when it comes to technology. And of course, now you as I as individuals can hope to survive to ripe old age because of things like the cleanliness of water, rather than just humanity surviving as a whole. But maybe those gains have been bought at really quite a substantial price, which is our disconnect. And that we're realizing that now because we've forgotten how to relate to the rest of the world, and so have suddenly found ourselves on this path of exploiting it. But a new story needs to be told. And so, when it comes to books like Sapiens, hugely successful, but I like to feel that the reason for that is not particularly because of that story it's telling, but because we realize we need to retell our story.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that the Sapiens kind of follows in that Durkheimian tradition where the origin of religion is some form of a noble lie or a social delusion that brought benefits then, but now we can transcend it and get the real story, and oftentimes in the Enlightenment and onward, that the real story is one where there's only that kind of external objectified account and there's no internal story to be told whatsoever. And it's fascinating to me that one of the places you start to raise that question is something that Robert Bellah brings up, where it's like, why does our account of humanity spend all of its explanatory power on our online time, like that time, that he's pointing to, like the energy we use for food, shelter, and survival, versus the offline time where things like imaginative play or, shared religious experiences, rituals, these kinds of things, like relation to ancestors or spiritual reality, these things that emerged in humanity way before what we call religion, typified by big God religions or science emerges. When we, that kind of recognition is very similar to the kind of wisdom that happens a lot of times in the counseling context, where even what individuals today are hyper focused on is their online time and such, and then end up diminishing their attention, energy, investment in these elements of humanity that used to occupy a greater period of our time and nested those relations of meaning and practices, rituals of social bonding.
Yeah, there's a great distinction that Robert Bellah makes, and again reminding us that we've read our past through our current preoccupations. To the extent that maybe for those who are telling the story, particularly, they're so online that they've forgotten what it is to be offline at all. And so they literally cannot imagine the way the past might be. It must have been always about struggle and production and seeking and consuming, because that is the way that life is now. And which brings in another facet there, which is the nature of the imagination and the way that imagination can carry us into different worlds, and so expand our world as a result. And again, this is a word that has relatively recently become very restricted. Nowadays, when people talk about the imagination, they probably just mean your private capacity to add a bit of color to the world. And if you're creatively inclined, then maybe you can turn it into some sort of production, like a work of art. But prior to this, if you read Shakespeare, the imagination has us rather than we having imagination. It flows through us, and our task is to cooperate with it. So when you produce something, you're responding to the muses who have inspired you, literally breathed into you that which you're producing. Now, it demands something of you to make it into a particular kind of manifestation, but the deeper current is really the fundamental source and wellspring. And you relate to that as much, if not more, by being offline, and so being able to sink into that, to allow the imagination to take a hold of you. And then you do the online bit to actually produce something tangible, but resourced by the time that was offline.
So when you think of Bella's work or Dunbar and kind of looking at the evolution of religion and how religious experience, and these things have a history that is worth tending to if we're trying to understand both what it means to be human and ask questions of meaning in the present. As someone who has that kind of regular encounter with people in one-on-one conversation, wrestling on those questions, and familiar with the kind of the big history of human imagination, evolutionary development, and such, like, what has spending time wrestling and understanding with the evolution of religion, how's that transformed the way you see the like what's going on when we ask questions, meaning, purpose, value, spirituality?
I think that it has convinced me that, I mean, I didn't really need convincing, but it's giving me another way of telling the story about how essential that is to what we are. I remember reading about the impact that control of fire might have had upon our ancestors. And of course, there is a certain story that says when, I don't know, maybe it was Homo erectus managed to start saving fire from lightning, for example, then it would have had safety value. And then maybe, I don't know if it was Australopithecus or Homo sapiens or Neanderthalis or whoever started to be able to make fire, then that ramps up the presence of fire even more in people's lives. And so the story goes that food started to be cooked, and again, very kind of instrumental engagement with fire. But then there was a whole other story that I remember reading, which is that perhaps the most profound impact of being able to control fire on our ancestors' lives was that suddenly the day could be extended into the night. That rather than when the sun went down, everything having to shut down through the hours of darkness, that the day became extended into the night. And it was extended in such a way that you had to sit around the fire, of course, but that would have promoted storytelling, myth-making, engagement in that way. But then also imagine the impact of the power of being able to extend the day into the night, and wondering what divine power that structured the day and the night was now, in at least in some measure, in your hands, because you could bring light into darkness. And so the ritual associations with fire, the way that the hearth and home somehow go together, that expansion of our spiritual imaginations must have been far more powerful and profound. We've just forgotten that now because we're so used to be able to flick light on and off, with a switch. But being able to be in the world still, of course, in the natural world, but also not wholly part of it anymore, because you could do, at least in some measure, that which the gods otherwise had been doing. That must have been enormously expansive on people's sense of themselves. And of course, the thing is that although, we might ditch the old religious stories in most part, the dreams kind of live on. The dream that this world in which we live is not the only world in which we might live. They just take this very kind of literal, mechanical form now. So we have dreams of going to live on Mars, or maybe the moon. It's the same kind of imperative, but flattened. And I feel that a much more rich and, in fact, even likely future is going to have to be involving the recovery of this inner life, that is not just our inner life, but is the inside of the whole world, as Owen Barfield put it. And I think that there's going to be a whole, renaissance of being that would become possible from that, rather than having to sort of ramp up the technological power to take the next step forward, as is the sort of standard scientific story. Which, to be honest with you, I suspect technology actually is asymptotic. So in other words, you get these kind of increments, but then ceilings are reached, and it becomes more and more difficult to push through that ceiling. I mean, I personally suspect that will happen with artificial intelligence. It's sort of happened with space travel, although there is a big effort now, of course, to get back to the moon. But if we were able to rediscover this fascination with interiority, I think that things might be unleashed in a whole new and unexpected way.
And I think the example of fire is really good, right? So the oftentimes the things that get featured in fire is the way it outsources, part of the energy used for our stomach. More energy is available for the frontal cortex, and then the features that's often told in an account of history that's focused just on the external life is just how the more complex forms of communication, language, and symbols generate greater cooperation for meeting those online tasks. But by just thinking of how it extends the night, that same energy is available, that same kind of cooperation, bonding, communication, symbols, to then think about the offline elements of humanity. And one of the kind of like challenges of just being human in the present, I think, is the permanent creep of online time, or where there's some kind of really like kind of the engine of our economic and cultural system becoming parasitic on more and more of the places where you would, if you think back to our ancestors, this extension of light into the evening that's localized around the campfire. Like, what did you do with the ability for language, communication, symbols when you start to tell stories and have more energy available for asking questions? And then what gets selected for when having narratives that build trust and cooperation enable you as a people to succeed and thrive and get to know your environment more, to pass on wisdom that you learn from generation to generation, because it's now encapsulated in speech and in narratives and stories. Like like even that one facet that almost everyone will point to as important. If we think to be human is just to survive, we miss the kind of like emergence of a spiritual reality. And I think that's one of the reasons I loved your concept of spiritual intelligence and the way it resonates and helps us, ask the question of the evolution of religion again, because there are certain capacities that come online when there's both the ability to communicate about it, like in languages, experience it, and shared trance rituals, these kinds of things, and those aren't just kind of accidental benefits for surviving.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's really worth holding out for things not even having instrumental value. I mean, I do a lot of work with a magazine fundamentally, but it's an online gathering and so on in the UK called The Idler. And what we really stand for is anything that doesn't have immediate instrumental worth, but is worth it for its own sake. And because it feels like one of the questions that we need to ask is, what is a good life? Why is something beautiful beautiful? What does it draw us towards? And it's not a new question, actually. I mean, Plato in the Republic has a very nice analogy here where he talks about someone who's been charged with looking after a great beast. And this chap decides that the way he needs to look after this great beast is to get to know it. And so he spends time in the cage with the great beast and watches what calms the beast, what excites the beast, what it needs to eat, when it sleeps, when it rises, how it moves even, so that he can accustom himself to the life of this great beast, which is sensible because he's been charged with looking after the great beast. But what then happens is that he slips from just the practical business of looking after the great beast to thinking, it's good that I live like this as well, acclimatized to this thing that I live with. There's a good in that. And the analogy is that life can become like this great beast, that we adapt to it rather than asking ourselves, what do we want from life? Because we forget to ask these bigger questions about what is good. And if you live online all the time, of course, you maybe feel you don't even have the time to be offline to ask those kind of questions. And the Idler is one place that we try and pursue that alternative.
You talked about how religions have transcended but included the kind of experiential kind of engine of kind of pre-big God doctrinally based religions. And so religion's still built on it. There's still this these kind of web of elements of experiential, emotional, mystical, ritual center, even if the way most religious practitioners articulate it, they're self-consciously doctrinal and drawing distinctions. Perhaps you could say a bit about that story and how the recognition of the deep history of religion for us as a species opens up the possibility of recognizing that perhaps we have a spiritual awareness for an immaterial niche that we've been exploring.
Again, I think that the switch to religion being regarded as either moral or doctrinal for the most part is relatively recent. I think it comes particularly with the Reformation, which is why really it's a Protestant Christian phenomenon. I mean, if you go to India and go to a temple, there's not much evidence of doctrines being proclaimed or even morals being taught. What you do is you have an immersive experience where you enter a mythology, or you take part in the devotion to a deity, or you perform a ritual of circumambulation or sprinkling or immersion and so on. So it's a very Protestant Christian kind of story that religion's mostly about doctrine and morality. I think you can pinpoint the decade almost, if you look at the history, about 1520, 1530, when the Catholic Church was bifurcating into what we now think of as the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church. And particularly figures like Luther started printing these catechisms. And of course, they could be printed. Printing press made them very much wide circulation. And then in the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church started doing exactly the same. And suddenly this idea came in that what you believed really mattered. And if you believed the wrong thing, even in quite a nuanced way, your eternal soul was at risk. And it's very striking because, even 50 years before, probably the vast majority of people that attended churches never uttered the phrase, I believe. The reason being because it was said by the priests in a foreign language, Latin, credo, up in the sanctuary, when they were sort of milling around in the nave, devoting their time to their favourite saint, or immersing themselves in the local holy well, or consulting the local sage or crone who lived in the cave. So again, this sort of sense that religion has always been about correct belief, it rapidly comes undone. But in the undoing, you suddenly realise that there's a whole way of life that has got lost, which is partly why I think, many parts of the world where Protestant Christianity has become so dominant, and its ways of thinking, because it's largely affected the Catholic Church as well, that things like pilgrimage suddenly have this new fascination, or indigenous wisdom has this tremendous fascination, or people get involved in the so-called spiritual but not religious, which normally means that they don't like the doctrinal bit, but they do want to explore the spiritual bit. Before, that wouldn't have been an issue. But yeah, so it's the reactions that tell us so much about what's got lost. But then, of course, the question is how to reintegrate that, so you don't just live in this reactionary state.
Yeah, I think that that kind of engine that shows up the moment religious traditions differentiate between the sacred and the secular, and the sacred becomes something that, there are sacred orders, there are shamans, there are particular vocations, and then there are particular boundary markers, especially as we get to canons, texts, creeds, and then the moment you have a whole bunch of wars and everyone's the different version of biblical Christianity, it intensifies, and that levels up once we're literate. And now more and more practitioners of a religious tradition are picking where they practice based on understanding truth and such. But that whole kind of the moment that distinction of sacred and secular come online, and then meets the engine of kind of enlightenment empiricism, the secular gets diminished. The elements that are legitimate and such that are tied to the sacred go down, and that's where we got that whole the popularity of the story of secularization and such. And one of the things I'm fascinated with that you've spent quite a bit of time talking about is kind of the all the different places in the West that has kind of been most crippled spiritually because of the bifurcation of nature, the shrinking of the sacred, and these kinds of things, that there's a kind of both a crisis of meaning and a new fascination and engagement with historic wisdom traditions and Christianity in much of the West. How does kind of your work in reflecting on this frame the way you see both the conscious conversation around the crisis and the allure and attraction of people from seemingly desperate groups returning to these wisdom traditions of the past.
I mean, I think that Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, has really nailed this with his book that came out a few years back now called A Secular Age, where he precisely challenged this secularization thesis, which is the progressive notion that humanity goes through maybe a mythic phase, then a religious phase, but anyway heads towards a scientific phase, and said no, what's happening is a supernova of different approaches. And of course, the difference runs through one individual as well as across a society. We feel cross pressures, as he put it, even within ourselves, let alone within the communities that we come up against. And this is at once terrifying and can be very disorientating. And you don't have to work that hard to see it playing out, certainly on the world stage, and maybe even playing out in your own heart if you look inwardly too. But at the same time, I'm very influenced as well by Owen Barfield, who I mentioned, this figure who was great friends with Lewis and Tolkien. And one of the things which he always said is that fragmentation and alienation itself has a meaning, itself has a purpose. It's part of what he called the evolution of consciousness. And he felt this was particularly built into monotheistic perceptions of the world, because you can only really sense that there might be a divine unity that lies within and beyond all things if that divine unity can echo in some sense of your own unity. The one God is only possible to perceive because there is some sense of individuality, the unity of myself and yourself, that can carry a mirror image, as it were, of the oneness of all things, and so perceive it at all. And so Barfield felt that actually this was really the significance of Christianity, that at the heart of Christianity is the figure of Jesus, who was both fully human and fully divine, and that this wasn't a kind of bolting together of two different kinds of being, but the reason why Christ could be a manifestation of divinity in all its fullness was because Christ, in the form of Jesus, the historical person, also embraced humanity in all its fullness, including death, and underwent that very particular life, which of course is what gets celebrated in the Gospels. The distinctiveness of Jesus is one of the things that stands out more than anything else. He's not some sort of generic wisdom teacher. And so this individuality, which is kind of causing us so much of a problem, is also intensifying our consciousness. And I think you can see how, certainly over the Christian period, not so much within individual lives, although, of course, people do have moments of awakening and enlightenment and so on, where they realize their true nature in the divine as well as in the human world. But across periods, maybe of cultural periods of time, you get these pulses of contraction when things feel like they're running out, the energy is running down, but then there's a new burst of life. We remember the Renaissance period. We even remember the birth of modernity as a kind of new kind of burst of energy. And so, Plato himself, these great figures, they didn't live in times of peace and tranquility. They lived in times of deep risk and pain and war and conflict and so on, when things felt to be breaking down. But it's in the breakdown that something new can be born. It's a long-standing spiritual perception that the way up and the way down are one and the same. Dante gets told right at the beginning of the Divine Comedy that he's going to be guided by Beatrice and other saints, including even the Virgin Mary, and yet he's going to be guided to go first through hell. There's no sort of shortcut to paradise. I find that worth holding on to, not just as some sort of hope that things might get better, but actually as an injunction to look into what's happening now and try and understand the spiritual significance of it, rather than just throwing up your hands in the air and resorting to a kind of contracted moral outrage.
Yeah. You talk about how religious practices, rituals, and these things, you ask the question, that's not often raised as to what are they being selected for. Like the moment they aren't just kind of like a epiphenomena of what's really driving the engine, but if we recognize just the role religious experience has played for humanity, and we don't kind of essentialize the concept of religion in these modern kind of belief-centered ones, then what kind of unpack that thesis of seeing religious and spiritual experience and traditions as a form of kind of niche exploration?
Yeah, so well, I mean, the notion of niche exploration comes from evolutionary biology. The person that I've read who's particularly developed this is Simon Conway Morris, but it's not just his idea. He's just a very distinguished evolutionary biologist in this area. But what it's about is the idea that evolution is as much a sort of search engine, if you like, as it is some random producer of variants that then get selected because they happen to survive. And so what evolution discovers are niches in the environment. So putting it very simply, you might say that creatures that live in the water have discovered the niche of the water and exploited it for their way of life. Or creatures that live in the air have discovered the niche called air and so have exploited that as their niche in which they live. But one of the things that fascinates me about Simon Conway Morris's work is that he doesn't think there's just material niches, but that there are immaterial niches as well. So there's moral niches, there's things that are good, that are beautiful, that are true, and that human beings in particular have self-evidently discovered those niches. And so we form societies which aren't just based on genetic connection, but are based on fellowship and based on a sense that there's something which transcends any particular relationship that we can all belong to. And so these are niches of ideas, and ideas are assessed according to whether they're right or wrong and so on. But what you can then do is a further thing, that it's not just the bottom-up effect, but it may be a top-down effect too, that it's not just that we discover the niche, but the niche discovers us. And in fact, this is something that Charles Darwin speculated about. He talked about love, for example, and it was very evident to him that, I don't know, he talked about pheasants at one point, and how pheasants display, and how it was clear to him that the peahen doesn't just select the cock because the cock's the strongest or the biggest or something, but because they're the most beautiful. They have the most sophisticated display or dance. And so Charles Darwin said, that sort of accounts for a certain amount of what drives us human beings, loving what's beautiful as well. But he said the strange thing about we human beings is that we count it beautiful when, for example, someone dies for someone that they don't even know, or when someone gives up their own right to live, even for an enemy, because they want to show love for the enemy in the hope that might be some sort of conversion of heart. And Darwin said that kind of love, it can't be a bottom up, because it's making a leap from the bottom up. So there must be a kind of top down influence that guides us towards these higher notions, you might say, of love and compassion, even for those that we don't remotely belong to otherwise. And for Darwin, he still had his religion available to him. It's become much more taboo to talk about things in that way in evolution, but you don't have to look that hard now for evolutionists who are talking about top-down effects as well as bottom-up effects. Biology is actually changing really very, very fast, and the old selfish gene, all bottom-up kind of account of things is actually, my sense of it is that it really started to run out of steam even in the 1980s, quite soon after the selfish gene was published. But the point is that the selfish gene and all that is such a powerful metaphor that we've yet to discover other ways of talking about it. And biology of all the sciences is probably the most heavily policed internally in terms of what you can and can't say about evolution, because of the presence of creationism and intelligent design and all that. But that's very much to the detriment of the public understanding of biology, where systemic influences and top-down effects and so on are now just very matter of course in terms of describing how organisms work and relate to the environment. I mean, maybe a breakthrough area here, just to be a bit more tangible, is in relation to fungi and mycelium and so on. Merlin Sheldrake wrote this great book, Entangled Life, that came out a couple of years back, and he's a very, very brilliant writer and has managed to find ways of talking about these things in ways which are becoming very acceptable now, in fact.
Yeah, yeah, and if people missed it, they should definitely check out the conversation with Merlin where we unpack that. Okay, so one last question, and this is more of my post-it that I stuck on all my notes last night from your work that I was like, I just want to ask Mark about this. So, and you mentioned just a minute ago, right, this sense in which kind of after Protestantism, religion kind of it gets differentiated by morals or doctrines. But that's a relatively recent addition to religion and its story evolutionarily. And then in spiritual intelligence and that kind of reflection, you talk about kind of these different epistemologies that kind of the dominant one in the Enlightenment is one where, like, to know something, you have this objective distance from it. And in seeking to know it, you're going to master it and control it. And that has this very kind of active form of knowing, in contrast to what's gained, right? When you look at the different features of spiritual intelligence you outline, it's one where there's a kind of intelligence that you only enact by investing oneself in it, be it a particular wisdom tradition or a practice, and then as opposed to seeking mastery or control, you're locating oneself in a kind of receptive or passive state. This kind of grounding in oneself beyond the ego self, or I mean, there are lots of ways we talk about it. And what's fascinating to me is how much that resonates with kind of like Schleiermacher's general critique of religion, and on religion as critique to the culture despisers. This sense where he's looking at people that are going like, you're dismissing religion because it makes you think you have to believe something stupid, or you think you just have to have some perfect final version of morals, or oh well, here are these doctrines. And he's like, what if our life is just diminished if we think our primary way of being human is what we know and what we do, and that you as the subject are the mastery of yourself. And then, he gives examples in high culture of like the arts and music. And he's like, the reason you love those is because it's an aesthetic experience, and opens up this sense, the taste of the infinite and this kind of stuff. And yet in his own work, he frames that in a public conversation and then says, and one of the gifts of wisdom traditions is that there are patterns and habits of consciousness that one gets to explore and receive as this a kind of experience of grace and wisdom. And, as a German Protestant theologian, he ends up talking about Christ consciousness, and it's a participatory reality and these kind of things. And I was rereading Schleiermacher recently, and then was going through notes on yours, and it seems to me that that Schleiermacher's invitation resonates deeply with what you're talking about, and could, in his kind of form of kind of public engagement, of talking about religion in a broad sense, but then also saying there is a gift of like engaging individual traditions in their particularity, because it's in that space that your epistemology shifts from like distance to invested, or from desiring mastery, control in an active mode, thinking, morals, doctrines, to one that's a receptive and passive one.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about the links with Schleiermacher, but thank you. That's very well made. I shall have to read the letters to my culture despisers once again. But yeah, I mean, I think you've got there's another great theme within wisdom traditions is the relationship between the particular and the universal, and that the universal is only accessed through the particular. I mean, William Blake, who I've been writing on recently, makes this point in his famous expression that it's to see a world in a grain of sand, or a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, or eternity in an hour. That certainly for we finite creatures, the infinite comes to us by embracing the finitude of life, not by trying to somehow overcome it. And I mean, another reflection that struck me when you talk about mastery is, I know in the New Testament, there are actually two words for power, exousia and dunamis. And exousia is the kind of control, mastery, you might call it patriarchal power these days, that wants to have life under its thumb, if you like. Whereas dunamis, from which we get the word like dynamic, is this power of allure, it's the power of attraction, it's the power of beauty, and it's often the power that's associated with Christ, whereas his opponents get associated with the power of exousia. And it's not quite passive though. I think there is a kind of, it calls something from you. It makes demands, but they are to be changed. As it were, to follow me, but it is to follow into rather than to take for oneself. And yeah, so that notion of power has been with me recently. I feel like we live in a world where a crisis about power is everywhere, and the rich are trying to seize power and control it, maybe even control it to good ends, but nonetheless to try and control it. And then people want power in, I don't know, psychotechnologies, or they want power in terms of AIs that can deliver them something that will help them do better in life or survive life. There's a lot of exousia power in one form or another around and about, but it seems that what we've forgotten is the dunamis power, which is the power to be drawn, the power to give ourselves, the power to love, and to be enriched in that way. And at the moment, I'm sort of going around trying to track where the dunamis power is, that energy, that quality of engagement with life, and participate in that. And when there's the other power going on, not let it dominate, at least, even though of course it has a big presence. But maybe that is some sort of response that's, I don't know if it's within this romantic tradition, like Schleiermacher, but I guess it is, because it is a sort of reaction against this enlightenment can command, control, get your beliefs right, and so on, and trying to remember that our life is part of a much wider life, and how we can resonate with that is really what's going to make life go well or not.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I don't want to end before you get a chance to let people know where they can connect with your work, which shows up in all sorts of different mediums and formats.
Well, thank you very much. I have a website, markvernon.com, where I try and make sure that everything has a link there, but I post stuff, social media, probably YouTube for the most part. I do a bit on Substack, and I write these books as well. My next book is going to be on William Blake, Awake, William Blake and the Power of the Imagination. So have a look out in that way as well.
Awesome. Well, I've really appreciated getting to talk to you. I had very high expectations, and you more than exceeded it. It's not always the case when you read people's books and stuff, enjoy it, and finally get to talk to them.
Hey, well, thank you. Thanks for your time. The dialogues are so important, because it is really in the in-between space of a dialogue that the felt sense of something worth hearing, and maybe even worth taking away and orientating your life around that a little bit more. It comes out in dialogue, so thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. And for people that are podcast listeners, if you've never listened to Mark and Rupert Sheldrake's podcast of dialogues, the next time you're on a road trip, then you should just do it, because it's quite a bit of fun. It has all the perks of like friend conversation energy among super nerds who are just talking to each other about the thing they were reading and super excited about at that moment. So it's very eclectic, but you get the dynamics go back and forth between you as friends that understand each other, and the contrast points and similarities, and they tend to be rather action-packed, fun conversations. So if you're listening to a podcast now and then going on a road trip and haven't done it before, just do some binge listening.